The moment Birdie Reed heard the smaller one say it out loud, she felt the ground shift beneath her boots like the earth itself had chosen sides. "We want her to stay, Papa. We already decided." 7-year-old Nora Yates stood in the center of the Yates kitchen with her arms crossed over her chest and her chin tipped up at exactly the stubborn angle her father used when he'd made up his mind and wasn't moving. Beside her, 5-year-old Colt had both fists balled at his sides, his dark eyes wide and serious and full of something that looked terribly close to desperation. He hadn't said a word yet, but he didn't need to. Every inch of his small body was voting. Birdie stood in the doorway with a carpetbag in her hand and her coat half-buttoned because she'd been leaving. She'd been absolutely, resolutely leaving. She'd made that decision 3 minutes ago, and it had been the right decision. And now 2 children were looking at her like she was the last solid thing in a world that kept falling apart. Eli Yates stood behind his children with sawdust on his collar and a jaw so tight she could see the muscle working in his cheek. He hadn't asked her to stay. He hadn't said much of anything in the last 24 hours, not since the accusation, not since the ugly words his brother Vernon had poured into his ear like poison, finding a wound. Eli had listened and he had gone quiet, and his silence had been its own kind of betrayal, but his children had not gone quiet. "Nora," Eli said, and his voice was rough, "this isn't your business to decide." "It is," Nora said without flinching, "because she's ours too. She was ours before she was anything else, and you're going to let her walk out because of something Uncle Vernon said, and Uncle Vernon lies." The words hit Eli somewhere visible. His eyes cut to Birdie over the tops of their heads, and what she saw in them was not the cold suspicion that had been there all day. What she saw was a man who was breaking open and didn't know what to do with the pieces. Birdie set her carpetbag down, not because she decided to stay, not yet. She set it down because her arm was suddenly very tired and because she could not look at those 2 children and walk out the door in the same motion. The human heart simply was not built for that particular cruelty. 5 minutes, she said quietly. "Someone explained to me why I should not be on that road." Nora uncrossed her arms and walked directly to her. Colt followed, and both of them took one of her hands, the way they'd started doing 3 weeks ago without anyone suggesting it, as naturally as roots find water. And Eli Yates stood there watching his children hold onto Birdie Reed like she was their North Star, and something fundamental shifted inside him. Something that had been locked for 2.5 years cracked at its hinges and let in light. That was the moment he understood what his children already knew. But to understand how a moment like that becomes possible, you have to go back 6 weeks, to a September morning in 1883, to the town of Harlan Creek, Colorado, and a widow woman with a carpetbag and no particular plan. Birdie Reed had arrived in Harlan Creek on a Thursday, which she'd always found to be the most unremarkable day of the week, and that had suited her. She was not looking to be remarkable. She was 26 years old, newly widowed after a marriage that had been kind but brief, and she was carrying everything she owned in 2 bags because the house she'd shared with Thomas Reed for 14 months had been repossessed by the bank in Pueblo when Thomas's debts turned out to be considerably larger than his estate. She was not broken. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of her own mind. She was not a woman in ruins. She was a woman who had experienced a series of events that had left her without a home, without resources, and without any immediate family she could call upon, and she was handling it in the practical, forward-leaning manner that her mother, God rest her, had always modeled. You put one foot in front of the other. You do not sit down in the mud and weep, because the mud does not care. Harlan Creek was not much to look at in September of 1883. The main street was packed dirt with 2 general stores facing each other at a slight angle, a blacksmith, a land office, a small hotel called the Meridian that had 4 rooms, and a dining table that served 1 meal a day, a church whose paint was coming off in long curling strips, and a saloon called the Yellow Dog that she intended to have nothing to do with. There was a schoolhouse at the east end of town that was newer than everything else. its pine boards still pale and raw-looking, and a doctor's office above the feed store that you reached by an outside staircase. Birdie had come to Harlan Creek because she'd seen a notice posted in the Pueblo post office, handwritten on good paper in clear, deliberate lettering. It read, "Schoolteacher needed. Harlan Creek, Colorado. Room and salary provided. Must have experience. Contact J. Aldrich, school board chairman. She had experience. She'd spent 2 years teaching in a one-room school in Missouri before she married Thomas Reed and followed him west." She wrote to J. Aldrich, and J. Aldrich wrote back within the week, and here she was. J. Aldrich turned out to be Josephine Aldrich, a woman of about 60 with white hair and sharp gray eyes and a handshake like a man who meant business. She ran the feed store with her son and served as the school board's only reliable member, the other two having moved away over the summer. She looked Birdie up and down with the frank assessment of someone buying a horse, and then she nodded once. "You'll do," Josephine said. "School starts Monday. I'll show you your room." The room was behind the schoolhouse, a small lean-to addition that had been built onto the back of the building for exactly this purpose. It had a window that faced the mountains, a narrow bed with a good quilt, a wood stove that was somewhat temperamental, a writing desk, and a hook on the back of the door. It was the best room Birdie had slept in since leaving Pueblo, and she felt something loosen in her chest when she saw it. "It's perfect," she said. "It's adequate," Josephine corrected, but she looked pleased. The children of Harlan Creek were, as Birdie discovered on that first Monday morning, a collection of personalities ranging from genuinely delightful to comprehensively challenging. She had 11 students ranging from ages 5 to 14, which was a typical spread for a frontier school, and one she was well equipped for. She organized them by ability rather than age, put the older ones to work helping the younger ones with their letters and numbers, and established an order of operations that had the classroom running efficiently within 3 days. It was on the third day that she met Nora and Colt Yates. They had not been there on Monday or Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, they appeared at the schoolhouse door together, Nora in front with the air of someone entering a space she intended to own, Colt pressed against her back like a shadow. Nora was 7, with dark brown hair in 2 neat braids that she'd clearly done herself, because one was slightly tighter than the other in a way that was endearing. Colt was 5, with the same dark hair and his father's jaw already visible in his small face, and eyes that were so deep and watchful that Birdie felt she was being evaluated. "We're the Yates children," Nora said. "Our mother died. We missed the first 2 days because our papa forgot to bring us." Birdie absorbed this information calmly. "Well, you're here now. Come in and find a seat." Nora came in. Colt held back. "What happens if I don't know my letters yet?" he asked. It was the first thing he'd said, and he said it with a seriousness that suggested he'd been worrying about it. "Then I will teach them to you," Birdie said, equally serious. "That's exactly what I'm here for." He considered this. Then he came inside and took the seat next to his sister. Within a week, Colt Yates had decided that Birdie Reed was the most important person in his world. He showed it the way 5-year-olds do, by appearing at her elbow at every available opportunity, bringing her things he'd found interesting, a smooth stone, a feather, the dried wing of a moth, and asking her questions with an earnestness that she found thoroughly disarming. He was learning his letters with a ferocious concentration, as if mastering them were a matter of survival, and perhaps for him it was. Nora's attachment was more measured but no less complete. She helped Birdie after school, staying to wipe the slate boards and stack the primers, asking questions that ranged from practical to philosophical without warning. She was exceptionally bright, already reading at a level well beyond her age, and she had the particular intensity of a child who has had to grow up too fast and isn't entirely sure how much of that to resent. It was Nora who mentioned their father for the first time in a way that lodged in Birdie's mind. "Papa works very hard," she said one afternoon, wiping a slate with more energy than was strictly necessary. "He works too hard, I think, He doesn't talk much anymore. He used to laugh more before Mama got sick." Birdie looked up from the papers she was sorting. "How long ago did your mother pass?" 2.5 years, Nora said with the precision of a child who has counted those months. "That's a long time to be sad," Birdie offered. "He's not sad exactly," Nora said thoughtfully. "He's just empty, like someone took out the part of him that knew how to not work all the time." She paused. "Colt doesn't really remember her. That makes me sad for him. Is that a strange thing to feel?" "No," Birdie said. "That's one of the most generous things I've ever heard." Nora looked at her with those sharp eyes. "You're different from the last teacher," she said. "He left after 4 months. He said the town was too small." "I like small," Birdie said honestly. Nora went back to wiping the slate, but she was almost smiling. Eli Yates came to collect his children on a Friday afternoon in early October, and Birdie met him for the first time in the weak gold light of a Colorado autumn, which was, she thought afterward, an extremely unfair set of circumstances for a person trying to maintain her objectivity. He was tall. That was the first thing. Not unusually so, but tall enough that she was aware of it, with the lean, worn look of a man who spent his days outdoors and his evenings worrying. He had dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw with 2 days of stubble and hands that were rough-knuckled and capable-looking, in a way that was difficult not to notice. He was, she estimated, somewhere in his early to mid-30s, which made him close enough to her own age that she filed that fact away without entirely meaning to. He took his hat off when he entered the schoolhouse, which she approved of, and he looked around the room with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Mr. Yates," she said. "I'm Birdie Reed." "I know," he said. "My kids haven't stopped talking about you." His voice was lower than she'd expected, with a rough edge to it that was not unfriendly, just well used. He looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they've been hearing about and are now attempting to reconcile with their expectations, and his expression while doing so was complicated in ways she didn't have time to interpret. "They're good children," she said. "Colt is making excellent progress on his letters. You should know that because he's worked very hard for it." Something shifted in Eli's face just for a moment, a softening. "Yeah," he said. "He asks careful questions," she said. "And he doesn't stop until he understands. That's a quality that will serve him well." Eli put his hat back on and she watched him look at his son across the room, Colt currently showing his sister something cupped in his hands with great ceremony. The look on Eli Yates' face in that moment was one of the most undefended things Birdie had ever seen on a grown man. Pure love, unfiltered, slightly helpless. She looked away because it felt like witnessing something private. "Thank you," he said, "for what you said." "I said it because it's true," she replied. "I don't offer false comfort." He almost smiled. She could see it at the corner of his mouth, that almost smile, and it did something annoying to her composure. "No," he said, as if confirming something. "I wouldn't imagine you do." He called his children and they went, and Nora looked back at Birdie from the doorway with an expression that was entirely too knowing for a 7-year-old. Birdie put her hands on her hips and turned back to her papers and told herself firmly that the warm feeling in her chest was simply the satisfaction of a teacher who had done her job well. It was not entirely convincing. October in Harlan Creek moved at the pace that small frontier towns move, which is to say it was busy and quiet at the same time. There were things happening at every moment: the harvest, the preparations for winter, the social architecture of a community where everyone's survival was somewhat dependent on everyone else's cooperation. But it all happened without urgency, with a steady rhythm that Birdie found herself falling into before she'd fully noticed. She learned the town as she learned her students, carefully, paying attention, refusing to assume. She learned that the general store on the north side of the street was run by a man named Prout, who kept his thumb on the scale when he thought he could get away with it. And the one on the south side was run by a widow named Clara Hess, who was scrupulously honest, and had a cat that lived behind the flour barrels. She learned that the doctor, A young man named Vance, who had come west from Baltimore with idealistic notions that the frontier had been carefully wearing away ever since, was competent and overworked. She learned that there was a tension in town between the newer settlers and the ranchers who'd been there longer, a familiar Western story about land and water, and who had the right to what. She learned that Eli Yates was considered one of the steadiest men in the county. He had a cattle operation about 4 miles east of town, a spread called the Rock Creek Ranch, not large by the standards of the territory but well run, and he'd built most of the buildings on it himself after his father died and left him the land. People in town spoke of him with a particular kind of respect that was different from mere approval. It was the respect people give to someone who has not bent when things got hard. His wife, Margaret, had died of fever in the spring of 1881, leaving him with 2 small children and a ranch that required constant attention. By every account, he had kept going. He had not sold the ranch. He had not sent his children to relatives. He had found a woman named Dolers to help with the children during the days, and he had kept going, and he had not bent. Birdie learned all of this from Josephine Aldrich, who was a one-woman archive of everything that had happened in Harlan Creek for the past 30 years, and who offered information without being asked, which Birdie had decided to accept as a gift rather than a provocation. "He's a good man," Josephine said one evening over the supper table at the Meridian, where she occasionally joined Birdie for the meal. Too much inside his own head. Margaret was the one who pulled him out of himself. Without her, he just went deeper. "I see that in his children," Birdie said. "They're both very self-possessed for their ages." "Had to be," Josephine said, not unkindly. Birdie thought about what it would mean to be 5 years old and have to be self-possessed, and she felt the familiar ache that she'd carried for children in difficult circumstances since she'd first begun teaching. The children came to her with small things. Colt came on a Tuesday morning before the other students arrived, carrying a page of letters he'd practiced at home, every single letter of the alphabet, slightly crooked and enormously determined. He set it on her desk and looked at her with those watchful eyes and didn't say anything. "You did this at home?" she asked. "Papa let me stay up late," he said. He held the candle. Birdie looked at that paper, at those wobbly, effortful letters, and thought about Eli Yates holding a candle so his 5-year-old son could practice his alphabet, and the warm feeling in her chest returned and was considerably less easy to dismiss as professional satisfaction. "Colt," she said carefully, "this is one of the finest things I've ever been given." He straightened up about 1.5 inches, which on a 5-year-old was significant. She kept the paper. She pressed it between 2 pages of the ledger she kept her attendance in, and she was not entirely sure why she felt the need to do that, except that it seemed important to preserve. November came with cold air and the particular clarity of high-country autumn, when the sky turns a blue so deep it seems theatrical. Eli Yates came to the schoolhouse twice more that month, once when Nora had a cough that turned out to be nothing, and once on a Friday afternoon like the first time, collecting his children at the end of the week. Both times, Birdie and Eli talked at the doorway while the children gathered their things, and both times the conversation ran longer than strictly necessary. The second Friday in November, she mentioned that she'd been having trouble with the wood stove in her room behind the schoolhouse, that it was drawing improperly and filling the room with smoke if she loaded it too heavily. Eli looked at her with a focused attention that she was beginning to recognize as his version of concern. "How long has it been doing that?" "About 3 weeks," she said. He said nothing for a moment, and she could see him working through something internally. "I'll come look at it," he said. "Saturday morning if that's acceptable." "You don't have to," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not why I said it." He came on Saturday, and he brought his children with him, which made the whole thing feel less fraught than it might have otherwise. He examined the stove with a thoroughness that told her he actually knew what he was doing, and he fixed the draw with a modification to the flue pipe that took about 40 minutes, during which Nora sat at Birdie's desk and read, one of the McGuffey readers cover to cover, and Colt sat on the floor and made increasingly elaborate patterns with the spare buttons Birdie kept in a tin for the children to use as counting pieces. When Eli was done, his hands were sooty and he'd acquired a smear of something on his cheek, and he stood in her small room looking at the corrected stovepipe with the satisfied expression of a man who has resolved a problem, and Birdie looked at him looking at the stovepipe and felt the ground shift slightly under her. "Thank you," she said, genuinely. "It's nothing." He turned and he seemed to become aware of the small dimensions of the room all at once, the two of them not very far apart, the quiet. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on her desk. "You should have said something sooner about the smoke. It's a health concern." "I'm not fragile," she said. "No," he said with that almost smile. "I can see that." The children were looking at them. Nora had put the reader down at some point and was watching with an expression of careful attention that Birdie recognized from their more philosophical after-school conversations. Colt had abandoned the buttons and was watching with wide-open, uncomplicated hope. "Papa," Colt said, "Miss Reed has books she hasn't had time to unpack yet. She told me." "Colt," Birdie said. "You did tell me," he insisted with perfect accuracy because she had. Eli looked at her. "He's right," he asked. "I have several boxes in the corner there," she admitted. "But truly it isn't urgent." "Could help," Nora said immediately. She had already stood up. "We're good at unpacking. We unpacked the whole house when we moved to the ranch. Papa says I'm organized." Eli rubbed the back of his neck and looked at his daughter with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and helpless affection. "It's Miss Reed's call," he said. Birdie looked at the two children, at their readiness, at their wanting to be useful in her space, and she felt something open in her chest like a window. "All right," she said. "But I get to decide where everything goes." "Obviously," Nora said, as if this had never been in question. They spent 2 hours unpacking books, and it was one of the more unexpectedly lovely afternoons of Birdie's recent life. She directed. Nora sorted with impressive efficiency. Colt handed books from the boxes with great ceremony, reading out the titles with increasing fluency, and Eli moved the heavier boxes and assembled the small wooden shelf he'd noticed she didn't have and, without asking, went out to his wagon and came back with a length of board and a few nails, and constructed one against the wall with a competence that was somehow both practical and, she was increasingly aware, quietly devastating. He did not talk very much while he worked. He listened. The children talked, Nora asking Birdie about every third book with genuine curiosity, Colt inserting questions and observations that were consistently more perceptive than his age ought to have allowed. And Eli listened to all of it with the particular quality of attention she was learning to recognize in him. Absorbed, present, occasionally looking at her from across the room with an expression she was running out of ways to categorize as anything other than what it plainly was. When they left, the room was transformed. The books were shelved, the shelf was solid, and there was a warmth in the air that was only partly explained by the now properly functioning stove. Colt hugged her before he left. He simply walked up and put his arms around her waist and held on for a moment, and she put her hand on his dark hair and felt her throat tighten. Eli watched this happen with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that she couldn't look at for very long. "Good afternoon, Miss Reed," he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "Good afternoon, Mr. Yates," she said. December arrived, and with it the first real snow. The children could not attend school for 2 weeks in mid-December when a blizzard buried the roads, and those 2 weeks were the quietest of Birdie's time in Harlan Creek. She used them to plan lessons, to write letters to an old friend in Missouri, to read, and to notice, with a clarity that solitude tends to produce, that she was thinking about Eli Yates with a frequency that was well beyond professional interest. She thought about this with her habitual honesty, and determined that what she felt was real and probably inadvisable, and not going anywhere regardless. She was a widow with no resources teaching in his children's school. He was a widower with a ranch and 2 children, and a grief that had set into him like a long Colorado winter. The power dynamics of the situation were not uncomplicated. She was not going to act on any feeling. She was going to be professional and kind, and she was going to be an excellent teacher to his children. And if her heart was doing something uncooperative in the background, that was a private matter. She had given herself this very sensible speech approximately 14 times before the roads cleared, and January brought the children back to school. Colt came in on the first morning back with his cheeks red from cold and his eyes bright and his arms extended, as though he'd been saving a hug for 2 weeks and was now delivering it with full commitment. She caught him and held him and laughed, which surprised her because she hadn't laughed freely in a while, and the sound of it seemed to surprise even the room. "I missed you," he told her factually. "I missed you too," she said, equally factual. "Papa missed you," Nora said from directly behind him. "Nora," Birdie said carefully. "He said your name," Nora continued, with the inexorability of a child who has decided that truth is on her side. "When we passed the schoolhouse during the storm. He looked at it and said your name, not out loud on purpose, just like it came out." Birdie did not know what to do with this information. She filed it in the same space where she was keeping all the other things she wasn't acting on and gestured for everyone to sit down. "We have 2 weeks of work to make up," she said. "Let's get started." Nora sat down with a small, satisfied smile. January passed and February came, and Harlan Creek settled into the deep winter rhythm of survival and community in equal measure. There were socials at the church, which Birdie attended because Josephine insisted, and because they were genuinely enjoyable, with fiddle music and the kind of dancing that everyone did. The whole town moving in organized patterns that seemed to Birdie like a living demonstration of community as intention. Eli Yates came to the February social. He was not, from everything she'd heard, a regular attendee of socials. He came in with his children on either side, wearing a clean shirt and a coat that had been brushed free of the ranch dust he usually carried, and he looked, in Birdie's estimation, entirely too good for the equanimity she was working to maintain. He found her near the wall where she'd been talking to Clara Hess from the general store, and he said good evening with a formality that was clearly covering something else. And Clara Hess looked between the two of them with the transparent glee of a woman who has read a great many romantic novels and recognizes a scene when she sees one. "I'll go get some cider," Clara said to no one in particular and left. "Your children were brilliant this week," Birdie said because she had to say something. Colt read a full sentence aloud without any help, and Nora's arithmetic is exceptional. "She told me," Eli said. "She also told me she thinks you're the best teacher in the territory. She's 7. Her sample size is limited." "She's also right," he said. The band started a waltz, and around them couples moved onto the floor with the particular willingness of people who have been inside and cold for weeks and are ready to move. Eli looked at the dancers and then at her with a question in his expression that was not quite formed into words. "I don't have anyone to dance with," he said, not as a complaint, just as a fact offered plainly. "Neither do I," she said. "Then it seems like we're both short of options," he said, and there was that almost smile, wider now than she'd seen it before, and her heart did something it had no business doing. She danced with him. It was a waltz, properly conducted with appropriate distance, and his hand at her back was steady and warm, and he danced well enough that she didn't have to concentrate on her feet, which freed her to notice things she should probably not have been noticing: the way he held himself, the quality of his attention when he looked at her, the thing that happened to his expression during the second turn when he forgot to maintain any reserve at all. When the music ended, they stepped apart. His children were watching from across the room with expressions of poorly concealed triumph. "Thank you for the dance," she said. "Thank you for tolerating my children's machinations," he said. "Nora has been planning this for approximately 3 weeks. I suspected," Birdie said, and he asked, one word carefully placed. And she said, equally careful, "I find I don't object to being planned for." He looked at her for a moment, full in the face with nothing guarded in it. Then he put his hat on and went to collect his children, and Nora, walking past Birdie, said very quietly, "Good." in the tone of someone whose plan had proceeded exactly as intended. February became March, and March was the month that everything complicated. Eli Yates had a brother. Vernon Yates was younger by 4 years, which made him 30, and he was a man Birdie had seen around town without ever having occasion to speak to. He worked irregularly, drank regularly, and had the particular charisma of someone who is very charming until you pay close attention, at which point something skewed reveals itself behind the charm. He had dark eyes like Eli's, but where Eli's were steady, Vernon's moved. She'd heard enough from Josephine to know that Vernon was a complicated figure in Eli's life, that he'd borrowed money more than once and repaid it less than that he and Eli had a history of disagreement going back to before Margaret died, and that Eli had a persistent blind spot where his brother was concerned, which Josephine characterized as misplaced loyalty and Birdie thought of as love that hadn't learned, yet that some people will use love as a tool. Vernon appeared at the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of March, after the children had left. Birdie was inside, banking the fire for the evening, when she heard boots on the step and turned to find him in the doorway, hat in hand, with the practiced ease of a man who is accustomed to making entrances. "Miss Reed," he said, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Mr. Yates," she said, because she recognized him clearly enough. "Can I help you?" "Just being neighborly," he said, stepping inside without being asked. "My brother speaks highly of you. His children are wild about you." He looked around the schoolroom with a thoroughness that felt less like curiosity and more like inventory. "Funny thing about my brother, he's a man of means, you know. Ranch, cattle, the land. A woman positioned right could do very well." Birdie set down the poker she'd been using on the fire and looked at him directly. "I am a schoolteacher," she said. "I am not positioned anywhere except at the front of this classroom." "Of course," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just think it's interesting. A woman arrives in town, takes up with a widower's children, dances with him at a social. People talk. People are welcome to talk," she said. "I've done nothing that requires explanation." "No," he said. "No, I'm sure you haven't." He turned his hat in his hands. "My brother carries a lot. The ranch, the children, the memory of Margaret. He's not always the best judge of what's good for him. That's all I'm saying." "What are you actually saying, Mr. Yates?" she asked. He smiled again, and this time there was something in it that was openly unfriendly. "Just that Harlan Creek is a small town, Miss Reed, and small towns have long memories, and a woman's reputation is a delicate thing." He left, and she stood in the cooling schoolroom and felt the shape of the threat clearly, because it was not particularly well disguised. Vernon Yates was warning her off his brother, and the reason for that she didn't yet fully understand, but she understood the mechanism. He was going to make trouble. She did not tell Eli. She should have. She knew she should have. But she also understood that whatever she told Eli about his brother would be filtered through 2.5 years of grief and solitude, and the particular tangle of guilt and loyalty that brothers carry, and she did not trust that it would land cleanly. She held the information and watched and waited, and she went on teaching his children and talking with him at the schoolhouse door, and being, she thought, appropriately careful about all of it. Nora sensed something because Nora sensed most things. "You seem worried," she said one afternoon after school. "Just thinking," Birdie said. "About Papa." "About many things," Birdie said. "Papa's coming on Friday," Nora said. "He said he'd come himself this week. He doesn't always because of the ranch, but he said he would." She paused. "I think he likes coming." "I think he likes seeing you safely home," Birdie said. Nora looked at her with absolute 7-year-old candor. "I think he likes seeing you," she said. "And I think you like seeing him. And I think you should both stop being so careful about saying so." "Thank you for your analysis," Birdie said. "You're welcome," Nora said, entirely serious. Friday came, and Eli came, and there was a quality to that afternoon that was different from the others, something in the air that hummed with the awareness of everything that had been accumulating since October. They stood in the doorway longer than usual, the children inside gathering their things with the suspicious slowness of children who are deliberately providing time, and the conversation drifted from school business into territory that was something else entirely. He told her about the ranch, specifically, about the east pasture where the cattle had been wintering, about the spring work coming up. She told him about a letter she'd received from her old friend in Missouri who just had a baby boy and named him after her husband's father. Small things. The kind of things you tell someone when you have decided, without fully admitting it, that they are your person to tell. Birdie, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. It landed differently than Mr. Yates or Miss Reed had ever managed. Yes, she said. He looked at her with those steady eyes, the ones that didn't look away when most people would have. I'm not, he started and stopped. It's been a long time since he stopped again. He rubbed the back of his neck and she could see him trying to find the right arrangement of words for something that was resisting arrangement. I just want you to know that the time I spend here, talking with you, I'm not just being, I know, she said quietly. I want to do this properly, he said. Whatever this is, I want to do it right. My children love you very much, she said, and they are very good judges of character. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Sunday. If the weather holds, would you come out to the ranch for dinner? Just the children want to show you the horses, and I thought, yes, she said. He exhaled, and she realized he'd been holding his breath. Sunday, he said. Sunday was the 19th of March, 1883, and the weather was clear and cold and brilliant, with a sky the color of polished steel warming toward blue at the edges, and Eli came into town for her in the wagon with Nora and Colt beside him on the seat, both of them rigid with excitement in a way they were clearly attempting to disguise as dignity and not quite managing. The Rock Creek Ranch was 4 miles east of town, along a road that followed the line of a frozen creek, and when it came into view, Birdie understood something about Eli Yates that she'd been intuiting for months. He had built this. Not the land, but everything on it. The main house, the 2 outbuildings, the fence lines running clean and true along the property edges. It was not extravagant, but it was solid. Every board set square, every fence post sunk deep. It was the physical expression of a man who takes care of things. The house had 3 rooms and a kitchen, a fireplace that heated the main living area, and evidence everywhere of 2 children and their father trying, with varying degrees of success, to maintain a home without a woman in it. Dishes clean but stacked imperfectly. A mended shirt on the back of a chair. A small boot in the middle of the floor that had clearly been there long enough to become invisible to the people who lived with it. Nora showed her everything with the proprietary pride of someone who has been waiting for this tour for weeks. Colt showed her the horses, specifically a bay mare named Tilly, who was, in his estimation, the second finest horse in the territory after his father's roan. Birdie let Colt place her hand on Tilly's neck and show her how to stroke it correctly, and the look of satisfaction on his small face when she did it right was one of the finest things she'd seen in a long time. Eli made dinner. She had not expected that. She'd expected awkwardness, perhaps an apology for the limitations of what he could produce, but what she got instead was a man who moved around a kitchen with quiet competence, producing a beef stew that was genuinely excellent, with cornbread baked in a cast-iron pan that came out hot and perfect. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" she asked. "Necessity," he said, "and my mother before she passed. She was a good cook and she made sure I could feed myself. She was right, too." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the children between them arguing quietly about which of Tilly's forelegs was slightly longer, a debate they appeared to have been having for some time, and he said, "I haven't had anyone at this table that I wanted to have here in a long time." "Neither have I," she said. "Had a table I wanted to be at." The afternoon extended into evening without anyone intending it to. The children fell asleep beside the fire eventually, Colt curled against Nora's side, and Birdie and Eli sat across from each other with cups of coffee, and the conversation went places that conversations only go when people have decided privately that there's no point in holding back. He told her about Margaret. Not about her death, but about her, who she'd been, how they'd met, what she'd been like with their children. He told it without performance, just straightforwardly, as if he'd been waiting for someone who could receive it as the truth it was rather than as a threat. Birdie listened without trying to arrange her face into anything. "She was a good woman," he said. "Was a good mother. I don't talk about her enough in front of the children, and I know that. Nora asks me sometimes, and he paused. I get locked up. I don't know how to give them the pieces of her without coming apart in the process." "You could start small," Birdie said. "Tell them one thing, just one. What her laugh sounded like or what she called them when she was pleased with them. They don't need everything at once." He was quiet for a moment. "She called Nora her little hawk," he said. "Because she said she watched everything like she was deciding where to land." Birdie felt her throat tighten. "That's perfect," she said. "Tell Nora that." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I will." When it was time for her to go, he woke the children gently and they drove her back into town in the wagon in the cold dark, with the stars enormous overhead. The children fell asleep in the wagon bed before they reached town. At the schoolhouse door, Eli helped her down from the wagon seat with a hand that held hers one moment past necessary, and in the darkness with the sleeping children behind them he looked at her with everything visible in his face. "Birdie," he said. "Eli," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "I think I'd like to keep doing this, whatever this is." "So would I," she said. He walked her to the schoolhouse door, waited until she was inside and drove away. She leaned against the closed door in the dark and breathed. She was, she knew, in serious trouble. The kind that doesn't feel like trouble at all. April came like a gift after the long winter, the creek running high and fast, the mountains visible in clean clarity, the world smelling of mud and new grass and the particular sweetness of high country spring. Birdie and Eli moved with cautious, careful intention into something that neither of them had named aloud yet, but that everyone around them could plainly see. He came to town more often than strictly necessary. She found reasons to be near the general store on the south side, where the road into town came from the east, at times when he might be passing. It was, she thought, completely transparent and she could not bring herself to care. Vernon Yates watched all of this with an attention that did not feel benign. She noticed him. He was careful about it, not obvious, but she caught him watching from across the street on 2 occasions, and once she saw him talking to Eli outside the land office with a posture that struck her as pointed, the angle of his body toward his brother, the set of his hands. Eli seemed fine afterward both times, but she noticed. April turned to May, and in the second week of May, Vernon Yates visited Birdie's schoolhouse again. This time he waited until the children had gone. She heard the door open and turned expecting a student who'd forgotten something and found him instead, and the expression on his face was different this time. Less charm, more conclusion. "I thought you'd have moved on by now," he said. "This is my classroom," she said. "You're not welcome in it." "My niece and nephew go here," he said. "I think I've got as much right to be in it as anyone." "What do you want, Mr. Yates?" He looked at her steadily. "I want you to understand what you're walking into," he said. "My brother is a man who falls hard and then doesn't recover. Margaret's been dead 3 years and he still hasn't let himself breathe. You come in here, win over his children, charm him out of 2 years of grief, and what happens when you get bored of a small town and a cattle ranch? What happens to those children then?" "I'm not planning to get bored," she said. "Nobody plans it." "Is that what you think this is? Me making a temporary decision?" He studied her. "I think you're a woman with a past that you haven't been entirely straight about," he said. And there it was, the thing she'd felt coming. "I think you came from Pueblo with 2 bags and a story about a teaching position, and I think there are things about Thomas Reed and what happened to his estate that you haven't told anyone in this town." The room went very cold. "Thomas Reed was my husband," she said. "He died, he left debts. I did not cause those debts and I did not hide them, and I used what was left to pay what I could. That is not a secret, that is just a life." "Then you won't mind if I mention it to my brother," he said. "Tell him whatever you like," she said. "I have nothing to be ashamed of." But she felt it as he left, the targeted quality of it, the deliberate framing of ordinary misfortune as hidden motive. Thomas Reed had been a kind man who was terrible with money and had died leaving her with nothing, and that was the whole story, the complete and unglamorous truth. But in Vernon's hands it would not be told that way. She thought about going to Eli. She thought about it for 3 days, and then she decided she would. She would tell him herself plainly all of it before Vernon got there with his version. She did not move quite fast enough. On the Friday of that week, she arrived at school to find the children absent. By mid-morning, she had a note delivered by a boy from town, written in Eli's hand. It said, "Something has come up. Children won't be in today." He'd written nothing else, and the blankness of it was louder than anything he might have said. By afternoon, the something that had come up was visible in Eli's changed behavior when she saw him on the main street, and the changed behavior was a careful distance, a reserve that was entirely new, that sat on him like a coat put on to protect against weather. He greeted her. He was perfectly civil. He was not there. She understood what had happened. She went home to the schoolhouse and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she felt, in sequence, anger, then sorrow, then a cold clarity that she recognized as the part of her that had survived Thomas's death and the lost house and the trip west with everything in 2 bags. The part of her that did not sit down in the mud. She waited. She gave it 48 hours, during which she taught school with her full attention, because the children deserved that regardless of what was happening with their father, and she was not the kind of woman who made children pay for adult conflicts. On Sunday evening, she went to the Rock Creek Ranch. She did not ask permission. She drove herself in the rented wagon from the livery, over the 4-mile road in the late light of a May evening, and she pulled up to the front of the house and got down and knocked on the door. Eli opened it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, surprise and something that might have been relief and something that was definitely struggle. "Birdie," he said. "I need to tell you some things," she said. "And I need you to hear them before you decide what you've already decided, because I think you deserve to have the truth from me before you settle on whatever version you were given." He stood back and let her in. The children were at the kitchen table. Nora looked up immediately with the quick assessment she always did, reading the room, reading Birdie's face. Colt looked up and said, "Miss Reed," with uncomplicated joy, and got up from his chair, and she caught him and held him briefly, and when she looked up over his head at Eli, she could see something happening in him. "Children," Eli said in the careful voice of a parent managing difficult circumstances, "go on to bed." "It's not bedtime," Nora said. "Nora." Nora looked at her father, then at Birdie. Then she took Colt's hand and led him toward the bedroom, and at the doorway she turned and looked at Birdie with an expression that was fierce and unambiguous, and it said, clearly as spoken words, "Don't let him push you away." Birdie sat down across from Eli at the kitchen table, and she told him everything. Thomas Reed, the marriage, the debts, the repossession, the trip west, the teaching notice, the 2 bags. She told it all in the same plain way she'd told it to Vernon in the schoolhouse, and she did not apologize for any of it, because none of it warranted apology, and she did not dress it up with feeling because it didn't need dressing. When she was done, Eli was quiet for a moment. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing." "That is the whole thing," she said. "Vernon said there were questions about the money, about the estate." "There were no questions about the money," she said evenly. "There was a man who died owing more than he owned. That is a misfortune, not a crime." Eli looked at the table, then at her. "I should have come to you," he said. "Before I pulled back, I should have come to you directly." "Yes," she said. He absorbed that without deflection. "I'm sorry," he said. "You're a man who loves his children," she said. "And you were warned about a woman your children are attached to by your own brother, using your own pain as a lever. I understand why you stepped back. But Eli, I need you to trust what you know about me over what Vernon tells you, because whatever his reasons are, he is not telling you the truth." "I know," Eli said quietly. "I know what Vernon is. I've always known, and I've let it not matter because he's the only family I have left and that he stopped. That is not your problem to carry." "Not my burden to carry," she agreed. "But it is something you'll need to address, for your sake and for theirs." He nodded slowly. They sat in the quiet kitchen with the lamp burning between them, and outside the window the last light was going out of the sky in bands of orange and purple, and the whole conversation had a weight and a tenderness that she felt along her ribs. "Birdie," he said, "when Vernon came to me, when he said what he said, the first thing I felt wasn't suspicion." He looked at her. "The first thing I felt was afraid. Because I've been afraid this whole time that something would happen to take this away before I figured out what to do with it." She held very still. "And the second thing I felt was ashamed," he said. "Because the fear made me stupid and I hurt you and you came here anyway to tell me the truth and he stopped. You're one of the finest people I've ever had the chance to know." "Eli," she said softly, "I know it's not enough just to say it," he said. "I know you need to see it. I'll show you, if you'll let me try." She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. This man who had been worn down by grief and loyalty and the daily weight of a life he'd built alone, who had shown her nothing but honesty and warmth and occasional confusion, whose children had taken her hands as naturally as breathing. "I'll let you try," she said. May resolved itself into a new arrangement, one that was more explicitly understood on both sides. Eli came to town on a more regular basis and made no particular effort to be casual about the fact that he came partly for her. She allowed it, which is to say she was genuinely glad of it and stopped pretending she wasn't. They walked in the evenings when the weather allowed along the creek road, sometimes with the children ahead of them, sometimes alone. He held her hand. It was not the dramatic gesture of courtship novels, but the simple, deliberate gesture of a man who has decided to be clear about something. Vernon made one more attempt. He came to her at the church social in late May, and he told her quietly and with conviction that Eli would never be fully free of Margaret's memory, that she was walking into a life that would always have a ghost in it, that she would never come first. She looked at him and she said, "I know about the ghost. He told me about her. She sounds like someone I would have liked. And I don't want to come first in some hierarchy, Vernon. I want to be part of a life that is real, with all of its history included. So whatever you're trying to do, it's not going to work." She walked away. He didn't approach her again. June was warm and fragrant, and the ranch in summer was a different place than it had been in November. The creek ran clear and fast. The cattle moved in the east pasture. The children ran barefoot in the evenings when their father would let them, which was more often than it had been, because something had loosened in Eli Yates since May, and the loosening showed in a dozen small ways. He told Nora about the little hawk name. Birdie saw it happen. She was there for it, sitting on the porch of the ranch house while the children played, and she watched Eli crouch down to Nora's level and say it, watched Nora's face go through about 14 things in 5 seconds and land on something that was fiercely private and enormously grateful. Nora hugged her father very hard and then went back to playing, and Eli stood up and met Birdie's eyes, and she could not have looked away if she'd tried. That was the evening he kissed her for the first time. They were on the porch after the children were in bed and the stars were out in abundance, and the conversation had gone quiet in that way that means something is about to happen. And he turned to look at her and reached out and touched her face with one rough hand, and she turned her cheek into his palm like it was the most natural thing she'd ever done, and he kissed her once, careful and sure, and then held her face in both hands and looked at her. "Birdie Reed," he said. "Eli Yates," she said. "I think I've been failing to tell you something," he said. "What's that?" "That I love you," he said. "I think I've been failing to say it for some time." She felt it hit her with the clean accuracy of something aimed precisely. "I love you too," she said. "I've been failing to say it for roughly 6 months." He laughed. He actually laughed, the full unguarded sound of it in the dark, and she felt it like the end of a long, cold winter. July arrived, and with it the question that had been coming since somewhere in the middle of February, the question of what they were building toward, what the practical shape of it was going to be. It arrived not as a conversation between the two of them, but as something that had already, in a sense, been decided by two smaller people. The morning of the day that Nora said, "We want her to stay, Papa," the day Birdie had been leaving with her carpet bag, The morning of that day had started with a conversation that Eli did not know Birdie had overheard. She had come to the house early, before the children were awake, because she and Eli had planned to ride out to the east pasture together, where he wanted to show her a part of the ranch she hadn't seen, and she'd arrived before he was done with his morning chores. She stood at the door of the kitchen, which was half open, and she heard Nora's voice, very clear and direct. "Papa," Nora said, "are you going to marry Miss Reed?" There was a silence. Then Eli's voice, "Nora." "'Cause I think you should," Nora said with absolute certainty. "I think she's supposed to be here, and I think you know that too, and you're taking too long because you're scared." Another silence. "It's not that simple," Eli said. "It is that simple," Nora said. "You love her, she loves us, we love her, that's all the parts." "You love her?" Eli asked, and his voice was different, softer. "Colt thinks she hung the moon," Nora said. She paused. "I think Mama would be glad, that's what I think. I think Mama would be really glad that someone like Miss Reed is here." Birdie stood in the doorway and felt tears she absolutely refused to let fall burning at the back of her eyes. She should have stepped back. She should have made a noise to announce herself. Instead, she stood there for one more moment and heard Eli say, in the quietest voice she'd ever heard from him, "Yeah, I think she would be too." She went back to the yard and approached again with audible footsteps and knocked properly, and the morning proceeded, and she rode with him to the east pasture, and she loved him, and she didn't say any of it because she was waiting for him to move at his own pace, and she trusted that he would. What she had not anticipated was Vernon Yates, who was not done. She'd thought he was done after the church social. She was wrong. What Vernon did was speak to 3 people in town, specifically 3 people who had known Thomas Reed, or who could be told they'd known Thomas Reed, or who could be given a version of the Pueblo years that was shaped to raise exactly the kind of doubt that would be difficult to disprove without evidence. He was not precise about the lie he told. He was imprecise in ways that were deliberate, that left room for imagination to do the work. Words like questions about her character and things that happened in Pueblo that she hasn't accounted for, and I'm only saying what I heard. It reached Eli through the second or third person, as whispers do, garbled and pointed at the same time. And Eli, who was a man who carried his fears in the place where other men carried ease, did the thing Birdie had feared he'd do since February. He went quiet. He went distant. He pulled back inside himself like a house shutting its windows against a storm. She saw it happening on a Thursday. By Friday morning, she had decided that she needed to give him space to think, and she had also decided that she was not going to sit in Harlan Creek and be gradually dismantled by a small man's lies while the person she loved let that happen. She packed her carpetbag. She was fully intending to leave. Not to run, not permanently, but she needed him to see that she was someone who had her own will and her own choices, and that staying was a choice she was making and not a thing she was trapped into by circumstance. She was going to leave, and she was going to write him a letter that told him clearly where they stood, and then he could decide. That was when she arrived at the schoolhouse and found his children there. Not for school. It was Saturday morning. They had walked to the schoolhouse from the ranch, which was 4 miles, and she understood in an instant what that meant, what it had cost them to do it, and the carpetbag in her hand became suddenly very heavy. "You walked here," she said. "Papa's horse is faster," Nora said, "but we didn't want to take him without asking, so we walked." "That took you 2 hours," Birdie said. "We know," Colt said simply, as if the math was not the point. What she stopped. She looked at the 2 of them, wind-red cheeks and serious eyes, and the absolute, unambiguous purpose of 2 children who have decided that something matters more than comfort. "Why did you walk 2 hours to the schoolhouse on a Saturday morning?" "Because you're leaving," Nora said. "We heard Papa tell Mr. Calloway that you might be leaving, and we knew he wouldn't stop you because Papa is," she searched for the word. "Papa is brave about ranch things. He is not brave about this kind of thing. He gets scared and he gets quiet and he lets the scared thing happen instead of fighting it. So we had to come." Birdie set down her carpetbag because her arm was suddenly very tired. That was when Eli arrived, because he had come home from wherever he'd been, on some early Saturday errand, and found his children gone, and understood where they'd gone and why. And he'd ridden his roan hard all 4 miles and arrived at the schoolhouse door breathing like a man who'd been running in his heart for months. He stood in the doorway and looked at the scene before him. His children, one on each side of Birdie's hands, holding on with everything they had. Birdie with her carpetbag at her feet and her eyes on him. "We want her to stay, Papa," Nora said, clear and unwavering. "We already decided." The room was very quiet. Eli looked at his daughter, at his son, at Birdie. He looked at all 3 of them in the early morning light of the schoolhouse, and something in his face changed in a way that was fundamental, something let go. "I know," he said. "You can't let Uncle Vernon ruin this," Nora said. "Uncle Vernon lies, and you know he lies." "I know he lies," Eli said. "Then why?" Nora started. "Because I'm afraid," Eli said, plainly and directly, with the kind of honesty that a man can only manage when his children are looking at him and he has run out of ways to be less than he should be. "I'm afraid that I'll do something wrong, that she'll leave anyway, that I'll lose." He stopped. He looked at Birdie. "That I'll lose something I can't survive losing again." The room held all of them. Birdie looked at Eli Yates standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse with sawdust on his collar and grief in his eyes and love all over his face. This careful, stubborn, broken-hearted man who had built every solid thing in his life from scratch and was terrified of the one thing that couldn't be built with hands. She stepped forward, and she left the carpetbag on the floor, and she walked toward him, and she stood in front of him and said, "Eli, I am not Margaret. I am not going to become a ghost. I am standing in front of you right now telling you that I love you, and I am also telling you that I will not wait forever for you to stop being afraid long enough to choose me. So choose. Right now with your children watching, choose." He looked at her. He reached out and took her face in both his hands the way he had on the porch in June, and she put her hands over his. "I choose you," he said. "Birdie Reed, I choose you. I should have said it 6 months ago, and I'm saying it now." Nora made a sound that was not quite a cheer but was in the same family. Colt said, "Does that mean you're going to stay?" "Yes," Birdie said, without looking away from Eli. "That means I'm going to stay." Colt said, "Good," with the same satisfied finality his sister had used 3 weeks ago. And then he went and retrieved her carpetbag from where she'd left it and brought it to her, because clearly it should not be going anywhere. Vernon Yates came to the ranch one final time, on a Sunday in late August, and the conversation he had with Eli was private and brief, and afterward Vernon left Harlan Creek on a westbound stage and was not heard from again for several years. What passed between the brothers, Birdie did not ask and Eli did not fully tell, except to say that he had made certain things clear to Vernon, about trust and about what it meant to poison a person's life out of jealousy over an inheritance, and that Vernon had chosen the stage rather than face the consequences of continued residence. "Are you all right?" she asked him. "Better than I was," he said. "It's been a long time coming." She thought about the weight he'd been carrying, the family loyalty that had been used against him, and she thought about the particular courage it takes to finally set down a thing that you've been told is love, but that has been, in practice, something less and crueler, and she was proud of him for doing it. Josephine Aldrich said, when she heard, "Well, it's about time," in a tone that implied she'd been watching this particular development since November and had been very patient about the pace of it. The proposal, when it came, was not dramatic. This was consistent with Eli Yates as Birdie had come to know him, a man who did important things quietly and carefully and completely. He came to the schoolhouse on an evening in early September, 1 year almost to the day after Birdie had arrived in Harlan Creek. The children were with him. They had all clearly planned this, because Nora was holding a small bunch of wildflowers that she'd picked from the meadow east of the ranch with a deliberateness that was evident in every stem. He stood in the middle of the schoolroom, in the place where she taught every day, surrounded by the desks and the slate boards and the shelved books that had become as familiar to her as her own hands, and he said, "Birdie, I have wanted to ask you this for a long time, and I have been working up to it, and I have been informed by my children that I have been taking too long. He has, Nora confirmed. Way too long, Colt agreed. Eli smiled, the full smile, the one that she'd been cataloging since November, and it was still one of the finest things she'd ever seen. Will you marry me? He said. Will you come to the ranch and be part of what we are? All three of us are asking. The children are asking louder than I am. Only because you took so long, Nora said. Birdie looked at the three of them. The man she loved, steady and earnest and entirely hers. The daughter who'd practically organized the whole thing. The boy who'd walked 4 miles on a Saturday morning to make sure she didn't leave. Yes, she said. All three of you are asking, and all three of you are getting yes. Colt made the actual cheer that Nora had been too dignified to make previously. They were married in October, in the Harlan Creek church with the paint still coming off in long strips, on a cold, clear morning with the mountains brilliant behind the town and the whole community present. Because in a town of that size, a wedding was a communal event, and everyone had opinions about how it should be done. Josephine Aldrich stood in the front row and looked satisfied in the way of a woman whose plan had come together. Clara Hess cried, which she'd been predicting for herself since the February social. Dr. Vance came down from his staircase office and said it was the best thing that had happened in town since the school was built. Nora and Colt stood beside their father at the altar with expressions of focused investment, as if they were watching the conclusion of a project they'd been managing for some time, which in fairness they had been. Birdie walked to the front of the church in a dress she'd made herself from fabric she and Clara Hess had chosen together. Dark blue wool that was practical for Colorado and fine enough for a wedding. And when she reached Eli, she looked at his face and found it utterly open, the way it got sometimes when he forgot to protect himself, and she was very glad to be the person who got to see it. The Reverend, a young man named Hartley who'd arrived in Harlan Creek that spring with a lot of energy and a tendency to preach long, was on this occasion admirably brief. The ceremony was simple. The vows were traditional. When it was done, Eli kissed her in front of the whole town and someone, she suspected Colt, clapped first and loudest. Afterward, there was a celebration at the church hall with food that half the town had contributed and music that the other half provided, and Birdie danced with her husband for the first time as his wife and thought of the February social and the waltz and everything that had happened between then and now, and she felt full of something that had no single name. Nora danced with Colt and with her father and eventually with old Mr. Prout from the general store, who she clearly intimidated considerably, and Colt ate approximately twice his body weight in pie and fell asleep in a chair near the fire, and Eli watched all of it with his arm around Birdie's waist and something in his face that was new. Not healed exactly, because grief doesn't work that way, but inhabited. Present in his own life in a way that he hadn't been for a long time. "Are you happy?" she asked him quietly. "More than I know what to do with," he said. They moved into the ranch together and made it theirs in the careful, practical, joyful way that two people do when they're both accustomed to having very little space of their own and are now learning to share it. Birdie kept teaching, because the school needed her and she loved it, and Josephine would have done something formidable if she tried to stop, and Eli went on ranching, and the children went on being exactly themselves. Nora's organizational tendencies found new territory in the ranch house, which she began managing with an efficiency that occasionally made both adults feel slightly supervised. Colt continued to bring Birdie things he found interesting, graduating from stones and feathers to full written descriptions of observations he'd made about the horses or the weather or the behavior of the creek in spring. Small natural journals in a child's handwriting that Birdie kept in the same ledger as the alphabet paper. Life on the Rock Creek Ranch had a rhythm that Birdie found she'd been waiting for without knowing what she was waiting for. Early mornings with coffee on the porch and Eli beside her, watching the light come up over the mountains. School days with the children of Harlan Creek in all their variety. Evenings at the kitchen table with homework and conversation, and the simple, enormous pleasure of a house full of people who were glad to be there. Winter of that first year of marriage was different from the winter before. The stove in the schoolhouse still drew perfectly, thanks to the flue modification that had started everything. The ranch house was warm and full. When the blizzards came, they were inside together, all four of them, and the being inside together was not something to endure but something to be glad of. Eli told the children more about Margaret that winter. He told them about her laugh, which he said was the kind that made everyone else in a room start laughing because it was completely irresistible. He told Colt about how she used to sing while she cooked, always the same 3 songs, none of them all the way through. He told these stories in the evenings by the fire, with the children in his lap, and Birdie sat across from him and listened, and she did not feel replaced or displaced, because there was no competition here, only the continuing project of making sure these children knew where they came from. Afterward, when the children were in bed, he looked at her and said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For making it possible for me to say those things," he said. "For being someone they love and someone I love, and making the whole thing big enough for all of it." She crossed the room and sat beside him and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the quiet for a long time. Spring of 1885 came softly, with the snowmelt and the creek running over and the cattle coming out of the winter lean and gradually filling out on the new grass. Birdie had been feeling different since February, a difference she recognized and had confirmed with Dr. Vance up his outside staircase in March, and she'd held it for a few weeks because she was not entirely sure how to say it out loud. She told Eli on a Sunday evening in April. She told him simply and directly, as was her way, and she watched his face do the thing it did when something hit him deeply enough that he couldn't arrange it immediately. He held her face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment. Then he kissed her forehead, then her cheek. Then he said, "A baby," in a voice that was hushed and wondering. "A baby," she confirmed. He pulled her against him and she felt him breathe, long and slow, and something in that exhale felt like the last of the long cold winter finally leaving. Nora and Colt were told the following Sunday after church. Nora took the news with serious-minded pleasure, immediately beginning to plan how the practical arrangements would need to shift. Colt's response was to look at Birdie for a long moment and then say, "Is it going to be my brother or my sister?" "We don't know yet," Birdie said. He thought about this. "I think a brother," he said, "because I already have a sister." He glanced at Nora. "She's good, but she's bossy." "I heard that," Nora said. "I know," said Colt. November of 1885 brought a son. He arrived in the first week of November, during a snowstorm that meant Dr. Vance had to stay at the ranch overnight, and he was healthy and substantial and very loud about his opinions. They named him James, after Birdie's father, and called him Jamie practically from the first hour. Eli held him with the careful, enormous tenderness of a man who has done this before and knows exactly how large a thing it is. Nora examined him with scientific thoroughness and declared him acceptable. Colt held him with both arms while seated in the rocking chair, with Eli's hands underneath for security, and looked at his brother with an expression of complete solemnity that gradually, as the baby gripped his finger, became something that was entirely soft. "He's strong," Colt reported. "He is," Birdie agreed. "He'll need to be," Colt said, in the tone of someone planning to make sure of it. Eli Yates grew through that winter into spring, and the ranch house was louder than it had been and warmer than it had been, and Birdie looked around her life with the clear, steady attention she'd always brought to everything, and found that she had built, or helped to build, something she had not quite dared to plan for. A life that was real and complete, with all its history and all its complicated parts and full to the edges. She still taught school. She negotiated with Josephine for a schedule that allowed her to continue through the spring of her pregnancy and return in September. And Josephine agreed in the manner of someone who had never considered any other arrangement. The children of Harlan Creek were hers as much as the Yates children were hers, all of them pressing their alphabet pages onto her desk, and asking their careful questions and growing in ways that she could see from season to season if she paid attention. By the spring of 1886, Harlan Creek had grown somewhat. A new family named Ortega had come from New Mexico with 3 children. A mining operation in the hills north of town brought men, and then women, and then the shape of a town that was slightly larger and more complicated than the one Birdie had arrived in. The school needed 2 teachers, and Josephine hired a young man named Alderman who was competent and enthusiastic, and not at all intimidated by Nora's evaluative scrutiny, which Birdie considered a significant recommendation. Eli's operation expanded that year too. He bought 30 additional acres along the creek from a family moving on, and hired a hand named Tors, a capable and quiet man who knew cattle and who took to the work with steady reliability. The Rock Creek Ranch became, in the common estimation of Harlan Creek, one of the better operations in the county, not the largest, but the most reliably and carefully run. Vernon Yates sent a letter from California in the fall of 1886. It was addressed to Eli and said very little of substance, only that he was alive and working on a fishing vessel out of San Francisco. Eli read it twice, then folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept papers and told Birdie about it that evening. "Are you going to write back?" she asked. "Maybe someday," he said. "Not yet," she nodded. "That's fair." "I'm not angry anymore," he said, which she believed because she knew him well enough by then to know when something was true in him. "I just don't know what we'd say to each other right now. Maybe that changes." "Maybe it does," she said. "People change." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the lamp between them, with Jamie asleep in the crib in the next room and the older children in bed and the whole house settled around them, and she saw in his face the thing she always saw there now. Not the old grief stripped bare, not the fear that had made him go quiet, not the carefully maintained distance. Just him, full and present and undefended. "You know what Nora said to me once," he said. "Which time?" "Early on, before I'd said anything to you. She said that you were ours before you were anything else." Birdie felt that in the center of her chest. "That's exactly what she said, the day I was leaving." "She was right," he said. "I want you to know that I know that you are mine and these children's and this place's, and that you have been from almost the beginning. And I was the last one to say it out loud, and I'm glad my children had enough sense to say it when I couldn't." "So am I," she said. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it and held hers with both of his. And outside the window the stars over Colorado were enormous and uncountable, and the mountains stood dark against them in the way they had been standing for 10,000 years, and would go on standing, patient and immovable, through all the seasons and all the changes and all the lives being lived in their shadow. By the spring of 1887, Colt Yates was 9 years old and reading at a level that still occasionally surprised his teacher, though it no longer surprised his stepmother. He had taken to helping the newer students the way Birdie had once seen him helped, with a careful patience that was entirely his own and a seriousness that made the younger children trust him instinctively. He had also become an expert horseman, Eli's natural apprentice on the ranch, and on weekends he could be found in the pasture with a focus on the horses that recalled the focus he'd once brought to learning his letters. Nora at 9 going on 10 was a revelation. She was reading everything she could get her hands on, borrowing books from Birdie's shelf in a steady procession, returning them with observations that were genuinely insightful and occasionally challenging. She had decided she wanted to be a doctor, a decision she'd arrived at by a logical process that she explained to Birdie one afternoon with complete reasonableness. "There isn't enough medical care in these towns," she said, "and most women don't want to go to a man for certain things, so a woman doctor makes practical sense. Also, Dr. Vance says I ask better questions than most of his apprentices." Birdie had told Eli, and Eli had looked at his daughter with an expression that was pure helpless pride. "What do I do with that?" he'd said. "Believe her," Birdie said. Jamie at 18 months was a person of pronounced opinion and enormous energy, currently in the phase of locomotion where everything in the house needed to be investigated and most of it tasted. He called Birdie Mama with the complete lack of complication of a person who has never known a world in which she wasn't, and he called Eli Papa with identical simplicity, and he called Nora Ra because Nora was complicated for him, and Colt was Cot, which Colt bore with dignity. He also called Tilly the horse something that was not any recognizable word but was clearly specific to her, because he used it only in reference to her and with great consistency. There was a Saturday in May of that year that Birdie thought of often afterward, not because of anything dramatic that happened, but because of the quality of it. The whole family was on the ranch. Eli was working on the fence line along the east pasture, a project he'd been meaning to get to for weeks, and Birdie was on the porch with a book while Jamie played in the grass of the yard under the watch of Colt, who had appointed himself Jamie's outdoor supervisor with a seriousness that Birdie found endearing. Nora was inside reading, and periodically she called out the names of places she was reading about in the atlas Birdie had ordered for her from Denver, as if she were announcing them to the world. Birdie looked up from her book at one point and watched her husband working along the fence line in the distance, steady and methodical, and she watched her sons in the yard, Colt with his careful attention on Jamie, Jamie with his absolute conviction that the corner of the yard where the grass was taller was tremendously significant and worth investigating thoroughly, and she heard Nora inside calling, "Missouri, Tennessee. And look, here's Colorado, that's us." And the whole afternoon had a feeling of fullness that had no edges, that simply extended in all directions as far as she could see. She thought of the morning she'd arrived in Harlan Creek, the 2 bags, the most unremarkable day of the week, the small room behind the schoolhouse with the window facing the mountains. She thought of those first days, of Colt appearing at her elbow with his smooth stone and his feather and his watchful eyes. Of Nora with her McGuffey reader and her almost smiling. Of Eli in the doorway with sawdust on his collar and the almost smile that was the same as his daughter's. Of the carpet bag she'd put down. She set down her book and looked at the mountains. They were the same mountains they'd always been, the same ones she'd seen from the window of the room behind the schoolhouse, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to human things. And below them in the afternoon light was her ranch and her husband and her children, all of them and everything, and she felt it with complete, uncomplicated certainty. This was where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had arranged it, but because she and this man and these children had chosen it, had chosen each other, had kept choosing through every difficult thing, and that choosing, repeated and genuine, was its own kind of permanence. She heard the screen door and looked around to find Nora standing on the porch with the atlas tucked under her arm, looking at her with those sharp eyes that saw everything. "You look happy," Nora said. "I am happy," Birdie said. "Good," Nora said with satisfaction. She sat down on the step beside her. "I think we made a good choice, Colt and me, when we decided you should stay." Birdie looked at her. "You know that I was already planning to stay," she said, "even before that morning." "I know," Nora said. "But Papa needed to be shown. He needed to see us holding on to you. He needed to see that we already knew." She paused. "Adults miss things sometimes that are right in front of them." Birdie laughed softly. "They do," she agreed. "You and Colt have very good eyes." "Mama used to say that I watched everything like I was deciding where to land," Nora said. She said it with ease, no longer the stiff, careful way she used to approach that subject. "Papa told me. He said that was what she called me." "The little hawk," Birdie said. "Yeah," she was quiet a moment. "I'm glad Papa told me. It's like having a piece of her." She looked at Birdie. "Is it strange that I can love her memory and love you at the same time?" "No," Birdie said. "It is exactly the right and generous and brave thing. It's one of the most generous things I've ever seen." Nora nodded, as if that had confirmed something she already knew. "I'm going to go finish Argentina," she said, opening the atlas. "It seems interesting." She went back inside, and Birdie watched her go and felt the fullness of the afternoon settle around her again. Eli came in from the fence line as the light began to lower, his shirt dusty and his face clear, and he came up to the porch and leaned down and kissed her, easy and unhurried, and Jamie in the yard saw this and made a sound of strong approval. "How's the fence?" she asked. "Done," he said, "for this season. And after this season, I'll do it again," he said. "That's how it works. You do the thing and then the seasons go by and you do it again, and the thing is what you chose to take care of." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains and his face was open and at rest. "That's a philosophy," she said. "It's just a fence," he said, but he was almost smiling. "Eli Yates," she said. "Birdie Yates," he said, because she was that now, had been for almost 2 years. She stood up and took his hand, and they stood together on the porch in the evening light. And the mountains held their position as they always did, and the children were around them, inside and in the yard and on the earth, and the life they'd built from a woman arriving with 2 bags on a Thursday and a man who'd been afraid for too long was real and full and solid, built from honest wood and set true, the way Eli Yates built everything. Late that November, Birdie told him she was expecting again. He received this news with the same hushed wonder as before, and this time she felt it in him without the complicated underlay of old grief. Just wonder, just gladness. "When?" he asked. "Late spring," she said. "June, probably." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment. "A summer baby," he said. "A summer baby," she confirmed. June of 1888 brought a daughter, born on the longest day of the year with a flair for timing that was already being attributed to her character. She was small and loud and completely certain of herself from the first hour, and they named her Me after no one in particular because the name suited her, which was reason enough. Colt held her with the same serious care he'd given Jamie, and Jamie patted her head with a gentleness that surprised everyone, and Nora said, with an air of conclusive satisfaction, "Now we're complete." Eli looked at Birdie over the heads of their children, over the baby in her arms, and in his face was everything he'd been afraid to feel for too long and everything he'd found the courage for in the end. She looked back at him with her whole face and her whole heart, this woman who'd arrived with 2 bags on a Thursday and found, without planning it, the precise place where she was supposed to land. "Yeah," he said quietly to Nora's announcement to all of them. "I think we are." And they were. In Harlan Creek, Colorado, in 1888, with the mountain standing witness and the Rock Creek Ranch solid beneath them, the Yates family was complete and full and real, built out of love, chosen freely, chosen repeatedly, chosen even when it was difficult and even when fear said not to and even when the seasons went hard. The children had chosen her first. He had followed their lead, and all of them had been right.